The first topic regarding John Stuart Mill that we're going to look at today is the harm principle. Now, let me read a passage from Mill's On Liberty, which I think is warranted at this stage. The principle is, by which he means the harm principle, that the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of civilized community against his will is to prevent harm for others. Now, what Mill is saying is this, is that there is one reason and one reason alone for which an individual or a group of individuals can stop another individual from doing precisely what they want to do, and that is if that person is harming another person. Therefore, it is perfectly acceptable for the state to outlaw murder. It's perfectly acceptable for the state to outlaw things which might lead to the harm of other people, driving too fast on the road, for example. It is not, however, acceptable to ban things which harm only the person that is participating in that activity. So, consequently, you can ban things which harm other people, but not ban things which harm only the individual which are doing it. Now, if you have a moral objection to something that an individual is doing, you're perfectly allowed to argue with them. You're perfectly allowed to point out your opinion on this issue. What you're not allowed to do is ban them from doing it. So let's think of some examples from contemporary society and apply the harm principle to them. The wearing of crash helmets, for example, doesn't seem to be justified upon the harm principle. If somebody is wearing a crash helmet, it seems to be protecting the individual who's riding the bike, and therefore no concern of anybody else's. Likewise, drugs, it appears, would be allowed upon this basis. Drugs only harm the person who are taking them, not society at large or other people, and therefore if somebody wanted to take what is now an illegal substance, Mill's harm principle would seem to say you should let them. However, I should point out again, this doesn't mean to say that Mill is saying that people should do whatever they want, because certain actions can be banned if they harm other people. Recently, for example, you know that there's been a smoking ban in public places in the United Kingdom. Now, many MPs argued in favour of such a smoking ban upon the harm principle, upon the basis that if second-hand smoke causes harm to others, then it should be banned. Now, very briefly here, why was John Stuart Mill asking for such a liberty? He wasn't necessarily saying that it was our right to do whatever we wanted in any given scenario. What he was saying is that on a utilitarian basis, it will make us happier. If we're allowed to do what we want, if we're allowed to do and say what we want, then as a general rule it would make us as a people happier, and that's why it should be allowed. So John Stuart Mill here combines the freedom implicit in liberal thought but with the calculation based in utilitarian thought. But there are some problems with the harm principle. Perhaps although its immediate appeal is that it's quite simple, it is actually far more complicated than it's made out to be. For example, precisely how do we define harm? Now, it's quite obvious that Mill thinks that harm is in terms of physical harm. Offending someone, for example, is not harm. Now, imagine that offence given over a period of time leads to sort of a psychological damage to an individual. Now, wouldn't that be constituted harm? Also, think in the broader sense of the kind of things that, upon the harm principle, it could be argued should be banned. If we can prove, and I suspect that many scientists would think it quite easy to prove, that emission fumes from cars and trucks and motorbikes and so on lead to increased asthma amongst children, then isn't this a case to ban the use of cars, because they do indeed cause harm to others? So consequently, precisely how we define harm and to what lengths we apply the harm principle means that the harm principle can be regarded as problematic. The second topic regarding John Stuart Mill, which I'd like to look at all too briefly here, is Mill on women. You'll notice through most of these little video podcasts that the thinkers that we've looked at haven't taken the role of women in society particularly seriously. Mill is perhaps the first to do this. And he comes up with this really rather nice argument, I think. The position of women when Mill was writing was dire. There was no rights within marriage, very few rights in front of the law, and they had no access to education and consequently were denied choice in terms of career, and therefore often had to marry for money. Men could marry for any reason they chose, women had to marry for money. And to those people who thought that the role of wife and mother was natural to women, John Stuart Mill simply comes up with the argument, if the role of wife and mother is natural to women, why would you ban them from education and ban them from other professions? If they're naturally going to take these roles, it's absurd then to ban them from others because they wouldn't go there, so to speak. So consequently, Mill's argument here is quite a good one and suggests ways in which women's position in society can be changed for the better. Mill's solution to improve the position of women in society was quite radical at the time, but may seem a little bit old-fashioned for us today. He said the crucial thing is about choice. At the time, women were forced to marry in order to get money because they couldn't work or they were denied education. Mill said women should have exactly the same educational rights as men did, and then have the choice about whether they wanted to marry and take on a wife's duties or get a job and take on the duties of somebody in the workforce. Now this is the thing. What Mill is saying, therefore, is a woman has a choice between being a wife and mother or having a career. The idea for Mill that a woman would be both a wife and mother and working, an idea which I would suggest is pretty commonplace and uncontroversial in today's society, Mill is not suggesting this. So whereas Mill increases the number of rights that women should have in society in general, he is far from being a feminist by today's standards. So to conclude, John Stuart Mill can be said to be a champion of liberty in two ways. First of all, he says that the state or other people have no right to stop you from doing anything that you want to do, so long as that action does not harm other people. People are not allowed to ban you from doing something on a sense of moral outrage, or they're not allowed to ban you from doing something because that something is harming you. You, as an adult, are entitled to do precisely what you want, according to John Stuart Mill. The second way he champions liberty is with regards to the position of women in society. He says women should have the same rights to education as men did at the time, and second of all, he says that women should be allowed the choice of following a career if they would choose to. However, as just mentioned before, Mill does not think women should combine the role of a mother and wife and a career woman. He says you need to have a choice, but it's one or the other. These are the ways in which John Stuart Mill has impacted on the history of political thought.